In the last episode, Lee Harvey Oswald had made his way from Helsinki, Finland to Moscow. When he requested Russian citizenship there, it was denied, which led to Oswald attempting suicide by cutting his left wrist. Now, it's disputed whether Oswald really intended to take his own life. There's a fair amount of evidence that it was a show suicide done to convince the Russians to let him stay. Either way, the attempt was enough to warrant a trip to the hospital and 4 stitches on Oswald's left wrist. In this episode, we look at what Oswald did next, including his visit to the American embassy in Moscow, the CIA's first documented interest in Oswald, and his relocation to the city of Minsk.
In Dallas, Texas, 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade in downtown Dallas. The first reports say that President Kennedy has been seriously wounded by this shooting. The flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time.
I don't know what this is all about.
Dallas police this morning resumed questioning the man they have formally charged with the assassination of President Kennedy.
I'm just a patsy.
The man is Lee Oswald.
Was Oswald acting alone, or was he a member of a conspiracy? The mission answers, he acted alone.
I'm working on I'm just a patsy.
This is Solving JFK. I'm your host, Matt Crumpton. After Oswald was released from the hospital, he was taken back to the Metropole Hotel by his tour guide, Rima Shirokova. As far as we know, Oswald spent the next few days in the hotel. On October 31st, 1959, Oswald visited the U.S. Embassy and told them he was a Marxist. Then, he tossed his passport across the consul's desk and said he intended to give the Soviets all the information he had acquired as a Marine radar operator. Richard Snyder was a consul at the U.S. Embassy when Oswald tried to defect. This is how Snyder described his first interaction with Oswald. Quote, "His manner was aggressive, arrogant, uncooperative. He appeared to be competent. He was contemptuous of any efforts by the interviewing officer and made clear that he wanted no advice from the embassy. Oswald gave as the principal reason for his defection, 'I am a Marxist.'" Declassified HSCA documents from another consul at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, John McVicker, tell us more about Oswald's state of mind. McVicker said, quote, "It seemed to me to be the possibility that he was following a pattern of behavior in which he had been tutored by person or persons unknown. It seemed to me that there was a possibility that he had been in contact with others before or during his Marine Corps tour who had guided him and encouraged him in his actions." If McVicker's hunch is correct, then who could possibly have tutored Oswald on what to say? Given that this is during the height of the Cold War, the KGB and the CIA would both be prime suspects if Oswald was being coached. McVicker's statement alone doesn't prove that. Oswald said he would share information he learned as a Marine radar operator with the Soviets. This would have been enough for Oswald to be charged with espionage and arrested on sight, but for whatever reason, that's not what happened. Not only did the U.S. Embassy not arrest Oswald, they may have gone out of their way to help him not lose his American citizenship. 3 days before Oswald visited the U.S. Embassy on October 28, 1959, Consul Richard Snyder sent a confidential letter to Gene Boster, the officer in charge of Soviet affairs at the State Department. The letter requested advice on how to handle an attempted renunciation of American citizenship. Specifically, it asked if the official protocols should be avoided when there's an American defector in the interest of leaving, quote, such avenues of repatriation as possible open to future contingency. Leaving the door open to future repatriation is exactly what Snyder did for Oswald. But Snyder told the Warren Commission that his letter wasn't about any particular case, and that he had only ever encountered one case of renunciation of citizenship prior to Oswald's appearance, and that case was already resolved. The timing of Snyder's letter is strange because it basically is requesting permission to not follow protocols for American defectors to make it easier for them to change their minds later. And then 3 days after this letter, Oswald shows up at the American embassy and Snyder makes sure that he does not legally defect so that Oswald can repatriate easily, just like he mentioned in the letter. To further add to the intrigue surrounding the U.S. Embassy, there's a cablegram that was sent by the naval attaché there to the Navy Department in Washington, D.C. on November 3rd. That cable references another communication about Lee Harvey Oswald on October 26th, 2 days before Snyder sent the letter. But we have no record of the actual document that was sent on October 26th, other than the fact that it's mentioned in this November 3rd letter. What could that other letter about Oswald be, since Oswald didn't go to the embassy until 5 days later? Remember, Oswald was the third American defector in 1959. One thing that he had in common with his two predecessors, Nicholas Petrulli and Robert Webster, is that they all went to the U.S. Embassy to attempt to defect on a Saturday when the embassy was officially closed. And all three of these men were ultimately allowed to return to the United States. It turns out that their defections were not legally effective on a Saturday when the embassy wasn't officially open for business. This left a path for them to return to the U.S. if they changed their minds, just like Snyder said in his October 28th letter. Why did Consul Snyder care about the fate of these Americans who wanted to defect? Was he just looking out for Americans and trying to be nice? Maybe. That is certainly one interpretation. It's also possible that there was some other reason why Snyder wanted to make it easy for these soon-to-be expatriates to change their minds. In the mid-1950s, while Snyder was studying Russian at Harvard, he worked with the CIA as a spotter to recruit Russian speakers into Project Redskin. The primary goal of Project Redskin was to coordinate with travelers who were going into the Soviet Union for legitimate reasons, like business or tourism, and then have those people gather information and bring it back to the CIA. We don't know that Snyder was actively working for the CIA while he was at the embassy, though it wouldn't be that surprising if he was, given that he helped the agency in the past. Ultimately, Oswald never signed the required renouncement papers to effectuate his formal defection, whether it would have counted on a Saturday or not. Snyder told Oswald to come back the next Monday to sign the papers, but Oswald didn't do that. While Oswald never legally defected to Russia, it was clear what his stated intentions were. He handed over his passport and a written statement requesting that his citizenship in the United States be revoked. Nevertheless, his American citizenship was never formally renounced because the specific required form was not processed on a business day, meaning that Oswald never legally defected to the Soviet Union. Immediately after Oswald left the U.S. Embassy, he started to have reporters contacting him looking for an interview about why he wanted to defect. After he turned down 2 male reporters for interviews, he agreed to speak with Aline Mosby on the same day that he visited the embassy, October 31st. Mosby admitted that she learned about Oswald from a contact at the U.S. Embassy, who mentioned Oswald when she asked for story ideas. Mosby wrote a story that included Oswald's background and his reasons for wanting to live in the Soviet Union. Her article was published via United Press International, which had a very wide publishing reach. About 2 weeks later, Oswald was interviewed by another female reporter at Hotel Metropole, Priscilla Johnson. Johnson wrote an article similar to the one Mosby had written, but for her employer, North American Newspaper Alliance. Incidentally, Priscilla Johnson would later go on to write a biography of Oswald with Marina Oswald. Aline Mosby told the HSCA that Priscilla Johnson worked for the CIA. And before Priscilla Johnson testified to the HSCA in 1978, she was granted immunity from prosecution for unknown reasons. Now, we don't really know where Oswald was from the time after his interview with Priscilla Johnson in mid-November until the end of 1959. The Warren Report says, quote, "For the rest of the year, Oswald seldom left his hotel room, but the American Embassy notified the State Department on December 1st that, quote, Oswald had departed from the Hotel Metropole within the last few days for an unknown destination." On the other hand, Oswald's historic diary has one big entry that covers this block of time. In that entry, Oswald basically says that he acquired Russian language books and was studying the language full time. Most of the other entries in Oswald's diary for days when he was just sitting in a hotel room are daily entries that include his meals and his feelings. For some reason, Oswald just wrote one big block of 6 weeks in one diary entry where he says he's just sitting around the hotel. And again, the U.S. Embassy says that Oswald checked out of his hotel around the end of November. So where was Oswald really? It's possible that we'll never know for sure. What we do know is that on January 4th, 1960, Oswald was finally given a Soviet identity document for stateless persons and told by Soviet officials that he was being relocated to Minsk, 450 miles southwest of Moscow. We've talked about CIA connections at Albert Schweitzer College, and before that, David Bucknell said that he and Oswald were both working with the CIA. But as far as the released document trail goes, this is where the CIA officially enters the chat. On November 4th, 1959, about 4 days after Oswald visited the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, the Navy headquarters in Washington, D.C. sent a cable to the American Embassy in Moscow with background information about Lee Harvey Oswald, including that he was a Marine who may have had access to confidential information. The end of the cable requested updates on significant developments about Oswald due to, quote, continuing interest of HQ, Marine Corps, and U.S. intelligence agencies. The last thing that the cable says in all caps is, quote, intelligence matter. About a week after this cable, the FBI posted a wanted notice card for Lee Harvey Oswald. This wanted notice led to Oswald being added to a watch list for the HT Lingual program. HT Lingual was a joint project between the CIA, the FBI, and the U.S. Postal Service to open and read mail from select people that were sending mail to and from the Soviet Union and China. The program was headed up by the Special Investigations Group of the CIA and led by its Chief of Counterintelligence, James Angleton. Oswald was one of 300 American citizens whose letters were opened and read as part of HT Lingual. But if a program exists to read mail coming and going to Russia and China, it's not surprising that the CIA would want to keep tabs on Oswald, since he did tell the U.S. Embassy in Moscow that he was planning to give military secrets to the Soviets. On the other hand, what is more surprising is that even though the CIA added Oswald to the HT lingual program, it didn't create a person of interest file for Oswald, known as a 201 file, until December 8, 1960, 13 months after Oswald defected to the Soviet Union and more than a year after the CIA started reading Oswald's mail. According to the 1960 CIA Clandestine Services Handbook, 201 files were supposed to be opened on persons of active operational interest at any given point in time. The House Select Committee on Assassinations asked retired CIA Director Richard Helms about why the 201 file was not opened on Oswald at the time he defected, or later when the CIA became aware of him and started opening his mail. Helms said, quote, "I'm amazed. Are you sure there wasn't? I can't explain that." So it was surprising to the former director of the CIA that Oswald didn't have a 201 file opened as soon as he showed up on the CIA's radar. The HSCA followed up on this issue of the late-opened 201 file by asking the CIA to indicate, quote, where documents pertaining to Oswald had been disseminated internally and stored prior to the opening of his 201 file. In other words, the HSCA wanted to know if there was no 201 file open when Oswald defected. Did the CIA have some other documents on Oswald that it was tracking? The CIA responded that there were documents, but because none of them were classified higher than confidential, they were all of low national security interest and were only retained for 5 years and then destroyed or thrown away. So those documents no longer exist. Professor John Newman asked CIA officer Robert Bennerman how the CIA Office of Security responded to Oswald's attempted defection. Bennerman would know since he was the deputy director of the CIA's Department of Security at the time. Bennerman told Newman, quote, "The 201 opening was something where we worked very closely with Angleton and his staff. When the HSCA asked Angleton's deputy at the CIA, Ray Roca, what caused the Special Investigations Group to open a file on Oswald, Roca implied, but didn't confirm, that Richard Bissell of the CIA may have been in contact with Oswald. The exchange went like this. Roca: it would be with respect to where and what happened to Deputy Director of Plans Richard Bissell's materials with respect to a defection in any of those places. HSCA: again, though, Oswald had nothing to do with Richard Bissell at this time, at least apparently. Roca: I'm not saying that. You said that. So the CIA started tracking Oswald in the form of reading his mail in the HT lingual program, but the CIA, for whatever reason, did not open a standard 201 file on Oswald until a year later, apparently because counterintelligence chief James Angleton decided not to open the 201, according to Bannerman. Roca's exchange with the HSCA about Richard Bissell is by no means a smoking gun, but Roca, Jim Angleton's deputy, isn't willing to confirm that Richard Bissell, a higher up in the CIA, was not linked to Oswald. Now that's not the same as him admitting that Oswald was linked to Bissell. Maybe Roca was just being extra cautious. But it sounds like he's saying that Oswald may have had involvement with the deputy director of plans of the CIA. That's a big deal if true. On January 7th, 1961, Lee Harvey Oswald traveled to Minsk via train. Once he made it to Minsk, the mayor gave Oswald a rent-free apartment overlooking the Svislak River. Most Soviets had to wait years for their own apartment, but Oswald got one right away. He was a minor celebrity, being the only American in Minsk. Oswald started his job as a metal worker at the Belarusian radio and television factory the next week. Alejandro Zeiger was Oswald's boss at the factory. Zeiger had 2 teenage daughters who Oswald would often socialize with. And Oswald's boss, Mr. Zeiger, would have long conversations with him over tea and cakes. Lee worked 6 days a week at the factory, and he would spend 3 or 4 nights a week hanging out at the Zeiger home. Ernst Titovitz met Oswald in the fall of 1960 at a party at the Zeiger house. Titovitz was Oswald's closest friend while he was in the Soviet Union. While they were in Minsk, Titovitz had access to a tape recorder and made recordings of Oswald's southern accent as a way for him to better learn the English language. We still have the recordings today. Oswald and Titovitz take turns role-playing at one point. There's a really interesting clip of Oswald pretending to be a fictional murderer named Jack Marr. He says some pretty awful stuff. Let's take a listen.
Now, I give the word to Mr. Jack Marr. Sir, here you have his voice.
Goddamn,
well,
give me a machine gun and shoot up everybody in the goddamn place.
Will you tell us about your last killing?
Well, there was a young girl under a bridge. She came in carrying a loaf of bread, and I just cut her throat from ear to ear.
What for?
Well, I wanted the loaf of bread, of course.
And what do you think to be your most famous killing in your life?
Well, the time I killed 8 men on the Bowery sidewalk there, they were just standing there loafing around. I didn't like their faces, so I just shot them all with a machine gun. It was very, very famous. All the newspapers carried the story. Well, it's all the same to me. I don't know. They're going to execute me tomorrow anyway. So, well, they're coming to get me now. I have to go. So long.
It's crazy to hear a recording of Oswald basically doing improv to try to impress his Russian friend. The part about being executed was a few years early, but eerily prescient nonetheless. The local KGB in Minsk kept Oswald under constant surveillance. The KGB put people in front of him who said that they had secret information to see how Oswald reacted. His apartment was bugged, and one of Oswald's friends in Minsk, who would sometimes help interpret for him, Rosa Kuznetsova, was a KGB informant. Oswald had several different girlfriends while he was in Russia before he met Marina. He wrote in his diary that he slept with a Russian girl named Anna 4 or 5 times in the fall of 1960 until she moved away from Minsk. A few months later, Oswald spent New Year's Eve 1961 at the home of fellow factory worker Ella German. According to Oswald's diary, German, quote, turned down his more dishonorable advances on New Year's Eve. Nevertheless, Oswald proposed to her the next day, and she said no because of, quote, lack of love and because he was an American and someday might be arrested. Then, Oswald quickly moved on to a girl named Nelia for the rest of January and February. This is how he described her. Nelia, at first, does not seem to warrant attention since she is rather plain-looking and frighteningly large, but I felt at once that she was kind and her passions were proportional to her size, a fact to be found out only after a great deal of research. On February 13, 1961, the U.S. Embassy received an undated letter from Oswald where he said he had become disillusioned in the Soviet Union and wanted to return to the United States so long as he wouldn't be prosecuted. The Soviets intercepted and read Oswald's letter to the U.S. Embassy, and after that, they promptly cut off his monthly subsidies. There was no U.S. Embassy in Minsk, so Oswald had to go back and forth with letters to Moscow. He asked if he could obtain his passport through the mail, but the embassy required him to personally appear in Moscow to confirm that he had not renounced his citizenship. A March 31st, 1961 interoffice memo at the passport office sheds light on why Oswald was required to come to the embassy in person to get his passport. The memo says, quote, "It has been stated that there is an imposter using Oswald's identification data and that no doubt the Soviets would love to get a hold of his valid passport. It is my opinion that the passport should be delivered only on a personal basis." This idea of an imposter using Oswald's identification data, especially in the context of passports, was later apparently confirmed. After President Kennedy was assassinated, Senator Richard Russell, who served on the Warren Commission, asked his friend and former Army intelligence colonel Philip Corso to look into the matter. Corso contacted the head of the U.S. Passport Office, Francis Knight, who told him that there were 2 passports issued to Lee Harvey Oswald, and they had been used by 2 different people. Next time on Solving JFK, we look at the beginning of Oswald's relationship with Marina Prusakova and the couple's efforts to make it out of the Soviet Union and across the ocean to America. If you heard anything that you believe is out of context, or if you have additional information to offer, you can let us know at solvingjfkpodcast@gmail.com. Please provide citations to the record for any fact that you're relying on. For transcripts, sources, and official podcast merchandise, visit solvingjfkpodcast.com.
In Dallas, Texas, 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade in downtown Dallas. The flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time.
Thanks for listening. Visit solvingjfkpodcast.com for more information.